So now in this next section, we're going to look at government policies that restrict international trade. We're going to analyze the economic effects of these restrictions on international trade. So when a country loses its comparative advantage in producing a good, its income is going to be higher from the goods it has a comparative advantage at producing. It can consume the goods other countries are relatively good at making at a lower cost. So what this means is that countries should not produce goods at which they do not have a comparative advantage, because they're giving up so much value that they could be trading for. But often there is political pressure on governments to preserve those industries that have lost their comparative advantage, or that have never had one in the first place. Well, let's look at an example of the U.S. market for ethanol under autarky, so when there's no trade. If the U.S. is not allowed to trade, or individuals in the United States are not allowed to trade in the global market for ethanol, all domestic consumption is going to be met by domestic production. So only what we produce in this country will we be able to consume. So here is a market in equilibrium, and the equilibrium price is $2, where the U.S. supply curve crosses the U.S. demand curve. And at that price, the equilibrium quantity traded is going to be 6 billion gallons. Now the consumer surplus is the difference between the U.S. demand curve and the price it's paid. So it'll be the difference between the demand curve and $2. And the producer surplus will be the difference between the price paid, the $2, and the supply curve. And it's labeled in that figure to the right. So consumers who are willing to pay at least $2 per gallon are going to be purchasing ethanol, and they'll obtain some level of consumer surplus. And domestic producers with costs lower than $2, lower than that equilibrium price per gallon, will sell their ethanol and obtain some level of producer surplus. Now let's suppose the U.S. government decides to open up imports and exports of ethanol. So they join the global economy, the global trade for ethanol. Now let's say that the world price of ethanol is $1 per gallon. So it's going to be lower than the equilibrium price in the United States of $2 per gallon. So what's going to happen? America will import ethanol. American consumers are going to benefit from this cheaper ethanol, but ethanol producers are going to suffer because there's going to be a lower price. Now, how can we decide whether allowing free trade makes Americans better off overall? We're going to compare the economic surplus in the market with and without free trade. So free trade is trade between countries as without government restrictions. So we don't have these import quotas, we don't have these tariffs, we don't have import duties. Now when imports are allowed, the price is going to fall to $1 per gallon because that's the international price. Now the U.S. production is going to fall to 3 billion gallons. That's going to fall to 3 billion gallons because at $1, that's all of the ethanol that can be produced for less than $1. So producer surplus is going to fall to E. Previously it was the area of B and E, now it's only E because of all the trades that are no longer taking place and the lower price that ethanol is being sold at. Now producers are going to benefit. At the world price of $1, trace down the demand curve to where it crosses the point of $1, 9 billion gallons are going to be purchased by U.S. consumers. So now the consumer surplus is going to be, again, the area between the demand curve and the price paid. In this case, the price paid is $1. So it will be, the consumer surplus will be the area of A, B, C, and D, because all those trades are now taking place. So overall, what's going to happen? Consumer surplus is going to rise, and total economic surplus is going to rise. There will be less producer surplus, but the consumer gains are going to far outweigh the losses to producers. Not only is more ethanol being traded, so it's being purchased by U.S. consumers, but is being purchased at a lower price. So as we saw from the previous example, consumers are made far better off by allowing international trade, rather than forcing them to only purchase the goods that are made in that country. However, the firms that face competition from imported goods are going to lose when free trade is allowed. So it's very easy to give these firms sympathy when you see them suddenly failing because of a change in regulatory policy that now allows international trade, especially when you see their workers start to lose their jobs. So typically what they tend to do is try to convince the government to restrict trade. And they typically use either tariffs, so these are taxes imposed by the government on imports, or by quotas, or numerical limits imposed upon countries, limiting the quantity of a good imported by one country to another. So now let's return to our ethanol example. Let's say that after allowing international trade, the ethanol producing firms lobby the government to impose a tariff on foreign produced oil or foreign produced ethanol. So if they have a tariff imposed of 50 cents per gallon, what that's going to do is increase the price in the United States to $1.50. So while the previous price in the figure on the right, our supply and demand curves, was $1, that world price, now the U.S. price is at $1.50. The world price plus the tariff. So what's going to happen? So now the quantity provided by U.S. firms is going to increase to 4.5. The U.S. ethanol consumption is going to decrease from 9 billion gallons to 7.5 billion gallons. And this is because of the new higher price. So the quantity supplied by U.S. firms is going to be determined by the marginal cost of production. So they'll produce up until the point that the marginal cost is equal to $1.50. And consumers are going to purchase until the marginal benefit they receive, so where the demand curve crosses the price of $1.50. In this case, it will be 7.5 billion gallons. So what happens? Producer surplus rises by the area A. The government gains the revenue of the tariff, so that's going to be the price times the foreign consumption. So that'll be area T. But consumer surplus is going to fall by the area of A, C, T, and D. All of that is lost to consumers because we now have this higher price. And C and D are going to be deadweight loss. So while A is captured by the U.S. ethanol producing firms and the tariff T is captured by the U.S. government, C and D are lost because these transactions are never taking place. Now let's turn to another example. We'll look at import quotas in the U.S. sugar market. So quotas and voluntary export restraints are effectively similar. Basically, quotas are imposed unilaterally, so one country imposes it, whereas voluntary export restraints are negotiated agreements, but they end up having the same effect. Now, the United States currently imposes a sugar quota, so it only allows 5.8 billion pounds of sugar to be imported into the country for consumption. So what this does is it keeps the U.S. price of sugar artificially high. So in the United States, it's 33 cents per pound, whereas the world price is only 20 cents per pound. What this does, in effect, is generate large benefits for U.S. sugar producers. They're made a lot better off because of the decreased competition in the global markets. And this comes at the expense of U.S. sugar consumers. So those of us who purchase sugar have to pay higher prices for sugar than we would if there was free trade. So beginning in the next slide, we'll calculate just how much each party is hurt or helped, so consumers and the sugar producers. So let's see what would happen if there were unlimited imports of sugar allowed into the United States. Basically, what would happen is the U.S. would import about twice as much sugar as would be produced domestically. So the sugar quota restricts U.S. imports, raising the price in the U.S. So at that price of $20, let's carry that across the supply and demand curve. So where 20 cents hits the supply curve, that's 9.2 at the price of 20 cents. So if we were producing at the world price of sugar. So 9.2 billions of pounds of sugar would be produced by U.S. firms. But U.S. consumers would consume 26.1 billion pounds of sugar, because they'll import the rest of that from outside the country, from other places. Now, because we have these import restrictions, the U.S. sugar price is artificially high at 33 cents. So let's trace 33 cents across the supply and demand curves. At 33 cents, just take that across the supply curve and down to the x-axis, and we have U.S. firms supplying 17.1 billion pounds of sugar. At that point, U.S. sugar consumption is 24.0 pounds. So it's going to be the U.S. production plus 6.9 billion pounds because that's the current sugar quota we have. So you end up with greater production by U.S. firms and lower production or lower consumption by U.S. consumers and higher prices than consumers would pay. So who gains and who loses from the U.S. sugar quota? Well, first off, the foreign producers gain by selling at the U.S. price. So those that are able to sell within that quota end up doing so at a higher price per pound of sugar. So that corresponds to area B in the figure on the right. U.S. sugar producers that are now selling at the higher price of 33 cents per pound of sugar, they end up getting area of the shape A, that former consumer surplus that now becomes producer surplus. And then areas C and D are lost, they're dead weight losses. So these are the value that transactions that could have taken place that are not taking place at this new higher price. So consumers lose A, B, C, and D, all those areas from this higher price that's being imposed due to the restriction in imports. So what are the total costs to society for maintaining these import restrictions? Well, a common argument in favor of maintaining import restrictions, just like for tariffs, is that it saves domestic jobs. It protects these domestic producers from foreign competition. So we have more American workers that are able to work in these industries and keep their jobs without being thrown out to unemployment and needing to find employment in other industries. Now, economists estimate that without the sugar import restrictions, we'd lose about 3,000 jobs in the U.S. sugar industry. So these jobs would be lost due to competition with foreign manufacturers of sugar. So now looking at the total cost of import restrictions, divided by the number of jobs, we can figure out the cost per job. So $3.26 billion of cost of maintaining this import restriction of lost value to U.S. consumers and additional increased costs paid. If we divide that by the 3,000 or so jobs, that ends up with about $1.1 million per job. So in order to save one job, it costs U.S. consumers $1.1 million. Now, this is probably an underestimate, since cheaper sugar would open up more jobs in the United States, for instance, in the candy industry. And it would encourage sugar-using manufacturers to remain in the United States. So, for instance, Hershey got in a lot of trouble. There was a lot of negative press towards them a few years ago when they shut down a plant in the United States and they moved it to Mexico. A lot of people complained about these American jobs being lost and foreign workers now producing chocolate that used to be made in the United States. But it makes sense for Hershey because they can save almost half the cost of sugar by producing in Mexico. So what these tariffs do is they raise the prices for goods that are being produced in the United States. They use components from other countries. And now with global supply chains, we end up with a lot of inputs into final consumer goods being made overseas. When you put tariffs on those goods, it makes it more difficult to produce in the United States goods that use those intermediate goods from other countries. So we end up losing other jobs that we could have in the United States. Now, sugar producers, like all producers who lobby for quotas or for tariffs, do so because the cost to them, or the benefit to them, is very high. There's a relatively small number of people. In the U.S. sugar industry, they estimate 3,000 jobs, whereas the cost is spread out across society, so across all consumers of those goods or services, in this case, in all consumers for sugar. Because the cost is so low, it's spread out across so many people, and the benefit is so high for the few that get that benefit, that they're going to do a much better job lobbying than all the people, all the sugar consumers in the country. So that's how we end up getting these tariffs and these import quotas passed. Now here are some of the examples of estimates of the cost from tariffs and import quotas at saving U.S. jobs. So for benzoate chemicals, the number of jobs saved by these tariffs or quotas are 216. But the cost to consumers divided by the number of jobs is over $1.3 million. So for domestic luggage producers, we're saving through tariffs. We estimate 226 jobs at a price tag of $1.2 million per job. So the cost to American consumers for maintaining these import restrictions and for tariffs are very high. It ends up costing us a lot of money per job because of the increased cost and the transactions that are no longer taking place. So let's make a connection to something going on in the real world. Let's look at the Smoot-Hawley tariff. So this is a very old tariff passed in the 1920s, and how the politics of tariffs work. So tariffs on foreign-made shoes began in the U.S. in the 1920s. So back in the 20s, in the lead up to in the early years of the Great Depression, U.S. farmers were struggling to sell all their crops at a high enough price for them to make money or even break even. So they lobbied for protection from imports of other crops from other countries. Now, politicians in their districts championed these protections because that's what their constituents were interested in. That's how they could get votes. Well, other politicians in other parts of the country promised their support for these farm protections, for these tariffs or for import restrictions, if the politicians in the farming districts would support the tariffs on manufactured goods in their district. One example of those is shoes. Now, this process is known as log rolling, where one representative will promise to vote for another representative's bill if they in turn vote for theirs. These negotiations, which began before the Great Depression, but were not passed until after the Great Depression was well underway, they resulted in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. Now, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff raised tariffs to their highest value in United States history. They ended up being, on average, about 60% of the value of the imports coming in. So these are extremely high taxes. And the actual percentage of tax raised on these goods were increased as the Great Depression hit. So as people were suffering and were losing jobs, the amount of the tariffs began increasing because it was seen as necessary to protect American jobs. Now, the effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff lasted through the Great Depression. It led to a collapse in international trade because obviously once we put a tariff on our goods, other countries are going to put a tariff on goods that we export into their countries. So because of this, we ended up all these countries began increasing tariffs on each other, and it reduced international trade. So it made it easier for American producers to sell within the United States, but it made it difficult for them to sell in any other country in the world. So it ended up harming their output and their ability to sell their goods. Now, the effects of Smoot-Hawley continue to this day. So in 2015, the U.S. tariff on shoes contains hundreds of entries detailing all these different tariff levels based on the type of shoe. So these are long-lasting and don't just go away easily. Not only are these difficult to comprehend and to make sure you have the right tariff for the right type of shoe, these tariffs protect a very small industry. So employment in the shoe industry has fallen from 750,000 workers back in 1930 to only 15,000 workers today. And countries also impose retaliatory tariffs on our exports. So most modern trade negotiations are aimed at reducing these trade protections between countries. So when two countries or when multiple countries get together for a trade agreement to reduce these tariffs, we try to reduce, or the countries involved try to reduce the tariffs on both countries. So it makes it easier for exporters and for importers in both countries to be able to trade with each other. So some politicians argue that we should drop our tariffs and quotas, completely get rid of them, only if other countries agree to do the same. So that requires going to each country and making agreements with them to each lower our tariffs on each other. Now, this makes it a lot easier to gain political support for these actions, as it'll generally cause economic pain, but it'll be to a limited number of people. If we agree to with another country to both reduce tariffs, then it seems more like a compromise rather than just giving up and harming our own workers at the expense of slightly cheaper goods. But our analysis in the previous slides, it shows that there is sufficient reason for America to remove its trade restrictions, what we call unilaterally, that just America should do it without forcing other countries to do it with us, or wasting the time and money negotiating for other countries to do it with us. The U.S. economy would gain from the elimination of tariffs and quotas, even if other countries didn't reduce theirs. We're going to take a very brief look at a couple topics in Section 7.5, the arguments over trade policies and globalization. So more trade takes place between nations when their governments encourage it rather than discourage it. So we'll have more trade, and consumers will be able to buy goods and services they meet their needs more if governments make it easy and if they don't actively discourage trade between countries. And trade between countries generally makes people better off because these are voluntary exchanges, they're mutually beneficial. So both parties, the seller and the buyer, are able to make themselves better off because they're getting something of greater value than what they're giving up. So in general, trade between nations makes both nations better off. And that's why economists are generally in favor of free trade and a freer trade than we currently have. But there are many people who don't believe that free trade or freer trade makes everyone better off and hence oppose it. And it's true, there are some, once there's tariffs in place, that are going to be made worse off by removing those tariffs. But remember, there's also going to be many people that are made better off by removing those tariffs. And if we look at the sum of the economy, it's going to make more people better off than the few people that are made worse off because of the removal of these tariffs that benefit them at the expense of others. Now let's look at briefly at different trade agreements in the 20th century, the major ones. In 1930, the United States instituted the Smoot-Hawley tariff. This increased tariffs to greater than 50% on most goods. The goal of the tariff being to protect domestic industry and to encourage employment during the Great Depression. Now, during the 20s, they had been renegotiating tariffs, and Congress had been debating about new tariffs to add or tariffs to eliminate. This came to a head in the Great Depression, and the process really picked up as the Smoot-Hawley tariff ended up being designed to protect people as they were suffering during the Great Depression. Now, obviously, this caused other countries to institute their own tariffs against the U.S. and against each other. So the ultimate effect of this was just killing international trade at a time when most domestic economies were suffering from severe economic contractions. So it was terrible timing for this to occur. In 1948, Western countries that were seeking to revive international trade after World War II formed the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And during this, there were several rounds of multilateral tariff reduction that followed. So all the countries together deciding they were each going to reduce their tariffs. And this makes it more palatable because every country is making it easier to import into their country. So while you have some domestic manufacturers that are losing, you have others that are gaining because of the lower tariffs on the goods that they export. Finally, in 1995, the World Trade Organization was established, and this replaced the GATT. So there were now over 150 nation states that became members, and they agreed to liberalize international trade. The WTO also provides dispute resolution processes when there's trade disputes. So when one country accuses another country of artificially selling products at a lower price, what we call dumping, in order to destroy local manufacturing, put them out of business, and then raise the prices, we're able to go through the World Trade Organization. So a country can accuse one of dumping, and then there's an arbitration process where impartial arbiters determine whether this dumping is occurring, whether this illegal and unsavory business practice is taking place, and then they'll punish the country or the producers that are engaging in these practices like dumping. So there's a way to resolve these disputes rather than just raising tariffs and trying to punish each other. To end this section, I'd like to briefly touch on positive versus normative analysis. So remember from early on that positive analysis reflects what is. It's understanding what the process is, while normative analysis is what ought to be. So saying what is the best course of action or what's a bad course of actions. So judgments about free trade, they necessarily are going to reflect personal values and morals that individuals have that are engaging in these conversations. So most of what we've talked about in this chapter, hopefully all of what I've talked about, but I'll hedge my bets a little bit and say most of it, has been positive analysis, has been trying to describe the costs and benefits and weighing the different costs and benefits, but literally just showing what is going on, rather than engaging in normative analysis or saying what we ought to do, talking about the optimal policy. So though economists often disagree, it's not unreasonable to value the cost of free trade more highly than the benefits. So you can engage in some normative analysis that ends up supporting tariffs, whether or not economists just doing the math and trying to maximize the value to all of society think that's the most important thing. And it's important to note that all tariffs and all protection policies are not identical. So some are, I think, worse than others. Some cause much greater costs or much smaller benefits. I've mostly, or pretty much exclusively, talked about the economic surplus, so the value to consumers and producers. But there's also, say, national security concerns. That maybe it makes sense for a country to engage in the production of a product, to engage in a certain industry, and put protections on that, so to make sure that they have a strong enough, manufacturing base in whatever that industry is, because it presents a national security concern to import those from another country, to rely on other countries in case a war break out or something, and then they're not going to trade with you. I tend to think those are mostly overblown, but this is a normative judgment on my part.